Hey, what's up, guys? Matt and Ryan here, DFS 5-Pack. We're going to talk over underrated athletes today. If you're wondering, yes, I shaved my head. It's pretty much the only choice for a haircut right now, and my shit was getting real long. So used a beard trimmer to cut my hair and my son's hair. He does not like his short hair, but I told him we don't see anybody who cares.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat over here. It's funny, for like a couple months before this all started, I was telling Sam, I was like, you should just cut my hair with my, or I don't even need to go get a haircut. She was like, you don't want that. And I was like laughing with her about it. And now I'm going to need her to do that soon enough. So yeah, it's funny how those things work. A couple other just maintenance issues or whatever. I watched a couple of our videos that we had done recently, and it was like hard to see me. I was so dark. So I put another light in this room and I fixed a light bulb up there. So hopefully it's better for you guys.
Awesome. Well, hey, thumbs up is always appreciated. We haven't been on in a couple of days. You've been watching Walking Dead. I've had my kids the last few days, and we've done a ton of like hiking out in the woods. We've had beautiful weather here in Wisconsin. And for those of you guys like just going through the quarantine blues, I cannot tell you how much it helped just to be outside, to actually get some warm, non-rainy weather around here and just walk around the woods and bring the dogs out and stuff like that. Like, it's just been a huge help to the psyche.
Yeah, it's a really nice day out here. I was telling you before, I got a problem with my foot, so I'm not happy about that. But I am happy about the weather. So good thing it's good for both of us.
Amen. All right, so we got about 20 minutes. We're just going to go through some of our favorite underrated athletes. I doubt we agree on any because this list is like so long to choose from. Because we're kind of picking from like our lifetime, which is, kind of like mid 80s going forward. So we got like thousands of people to choose from. When you're talking like favorite movies, like American History X is on everybody's favorite list of favorite movies, right? Like, you're going to agree on stuff like that. Underrated athletes, like, I could go on for days on this list. So I'll kick it off. I actually saw this guy on an underrated athlete list a while back, and it's always stuck in my head. Andre Reed, wide receiver of the Buffalo Bills throughout those great years where they made the Super Bowls 4 years in a row. Hall of Fame snub if there's ever been one. And he doesn't get some of the recognition he deserves because, one, those teams are really good. They never won the chip, but football's a team sport, so that doesn't mean much from a wide receiver perspective. But he played in a 50-50 offense, which means it was half run, half pass. He didn't play in one of these like modern day NFL offenses where they throw it 66% of the time. Also, when you play in Buffalo, there are a few places to play that are worse for a wide receiver. And what I mean by that, outdoors, you got 4 or 5 games a year potentially in the elements where it is not good for wide receiving. So even though he's got almost 14,000 career yards, I mean, if you put him in a dome or without a team without Thurman Thomas, like, this dude could be damn near 20,000 yards.
I don't disagree with that at all. Now, I want to preface this by saying, before I even get into this, in the generation now, and even when we were growing up, but certainly not as much as now, it's hard to find guys that are that underrated because of the internet. Everyone's talking. When a guy is playing well, he's getting pubbed because that's just the nature of the world we live in. I love that Andre Reed call. I had a couple wide receivers on my list, and I could not rank my guys 1 through 10. So I broke them up
at all. There's just a list of 10 for me too.
I just broke up football, basketball, and baseball. So kind of on that same note, didn't have the team success that Andre Reed had. Interested to see how their numbers would stack up, and that's Jimmy Smith.
Ooh, that's a good call. Yeah, I've completely forgotten about. He was really good.
He was really good for Jacksonville. Again, it's hard to compare guys, from then to now, but this guy was shit number one on a real good Jacksonville team when they were running with Fred Taylor and Maurice Jones-Drew, came a couple of years later. The wideout tandem of Jimmy Smith and Keenan McCardell was really good.
Yeah, actually, I'm pulling up Jimmy Smith, but I pulled up the other Jimmy Smith on accident just because I wanted to see his stats again. He was a heck of a receiver. Yeah, his stats yards-wise is a little under Andre Reed's, but if you just look at like his yardage per year, because he really didn't get going until he was 26. I mean, he had a really nice career. Not as big of a red zone threat, never hit double-digit touchdowns, but this guy had 1,200-plus yards in like 5 to 6 years. He was good.
Real good. So, guy that came to mind when when we first decided we were going to do underrated, kind of fits that Andre Reed mold. What you got next?
So just the fact, if you want to think about Jimmy Smith being underrated, it's not even a guy that like came into
Yeah,
my mind. And that's why I was trying to look at some of these guys that from
that's
a historic perspective don't get brought up in the light that they should be.
that's how Andre Reed was for me. Like I felt that's exactly how I felt when you said Andre Reed.
All right, so I was kind of all over the place for the sports, so I'm gonna hit up baseball right now. And this is one you probably don't have them because we probably don't have any similarities just because of just randomness, but always underappreciated. And you mentioned him the other night, Craig Biggio. You there?
Yeah, we froze up, but we're back now. Who'd you have?
Craig Biggio.
So I did not have him. Not sure that I would consider him like that underrated. He's a Hall of Famer, isn't he?
Yes, but when I think about, so I think a lot of these guys who played in the steroid era get underappreciated because they didn't hit the long ball. And so like their names, I'm going to bring up another guy in a little bit that's kind of the same thing. From a historic perspective, he didn't get the pub he deserved at the time because, guys were jacking 50, 60 home runs a year and he wasn't just a straight power hitter, He'd hit his 20 home runs, but he'd also steal bases, won multiple Golden Gloves, switched positions multiple times throughout his career. And if you go take a look at his numbers, if you asked a random baseball fan, who's a better baseball player, Derek Jeter or Craig Biggio? Like you probably get 99 Derek Jeters and one Craig Biggio. But like numbers wise, they're like the same guy.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Makes a lot of sense. He certainly fits the list. Again, just because you're really good like Biggio was doesn't mean you can't be underrated at all. Matter of fact, the top guy on my list, who if I had to pick a number one, is like still considered, one of the best basketball players of our lifetime. So,
Okay.
so there's that. So I get it.
Who is
Tim
it?
Duncan. Tim Duncan.
Okay. Why do
So
you find him to be underrated? Because it is a subjective opinion, and I could probably buy into whatever you're selling.
So for me, when I think of underrated, I think about, getting love from the media, getting love from the masses. Tim Duncan just doesn't get that. Very underspoken. When he was in the league, he wasn't a big ego, a big personality type of guy. When you think about the best big man, like for us growing up, you ask, 20 average NBA fans, guys that don't really know the game, it's Shaq, 100%. They're going to say Shaq, 20 out of 20, in my opinion. I'm not saying Duncan was better than Shaq, but he's right there.
Okay, so and sometimes Shaq gets underrated though too because he never gets brought up who's the greatest basketball player of all time. And again, because of his lack of skill, because he was all size, like I actually thought about Shaq for about 5 minutes if I could consider him underrated because when he was at his prime, the most dominant thing I've ever seen. I think Shaq at his prime rivals LeBron, Michael Jordan,
Yeah.
just for how dominant he was and how he affected the outcome of a game. Now, he got out of shape and, he ran with Kobe, so Kobe gets a little too much love because those three championships, to me, that was Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe was kind of like the Robin, right?
For sure. I don't consider Shaq underrated. I get your points because listen, like you said about Tim Duncan, it's all subjective, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm actually going to hit up that same Spurs team because you want to talk about underrated. I think one of the most underrated basketball players of our lifetime is going to be Manu Ginobili of those same Spurs. Yeah, because
you said it.
Yeah, one, he comes off the bench. And we talk about this all the time from DFS. Like people think coming off the bench means you're not as good. That's just how Pop got it to work. Pop had to talk him into it. But once Manu bought into his role on that team, and as great as Parker and Duncan were, there was a lot of times at the end of the game, Ginobili closed for those Spurs. He was a spark plug. He brought a lot of energy. He had some, career success outside of the NBA internationally and things like that. He played for a long time. And his stats don't necessarily like add up from somebody who might play like a type of wing position like that. But he also played like 3, 4, 5 minutes less per game. And the way that they used him, and again, I don't know how many rings he ended up with. I can't remember if it was 4 or if he was there for all 5 of them. But like that guy, like I hate the Spurs. Like I respect them, but they're just boring to me and I don't enjoy them. I liked watching the Suns back in the day and they would take some of their allure away from them. Like Ginobili was a guy that like when you needed a bucket at crunch time, he was as clutch as almost any guy that I can remember.
Yeah, I definitely can get on board with that call. Had a lot of success overseas. So I think he played for Argentina, where he's from. I'm not positive though.
Yeah, I think you're right.
lot of success over there. So, came into the league as an older guy. Really, you're right. He doesn't get brought up at all from guys that weren't, when younger generations now talk about, those Spurs teams, he never gets brought up, but he should. No doubt about that.
If you put Ginobili like on the modern day, like a Wizards, like dude would average 29 points a game with like 8 or 9 assists, and he would just put up numbers. But that wasn't what he was asked to do. He was asked to come off the bench, give the Spurs energy, and close for him down the stretch. Because as great as Parker was, like he wasn't a great jump shooter early, and then he got better, but he was still like never a 3-point shooter, for example. So I don't like the Spurs, but I respect the hell out of Manu.
I agree with that call. Kind of another basketball player that I have, switching gears, came into the league more talented than Manu and was really good for a while. Was never a guy that won a championship and fell off. But I think because he fell off, it has made how good he was underrated, and that's Grant Hill. He was awesome.
Man, injuries. Like he was going down as all-time great until all the injuries piled up. Yeah.
Like he was awesome for Detroit, and that never even gets talked about. Now, again, it wasn't for that long, and it's hard to say a guy, like you said, with that many injuries is underrated, but I think his peak is now underrated because...
So I got a couple guys I'm going to bring up because of their peak, so I know exactly where you're going.
Yeah, so like you just said, man, he was on his way to being like an all-time great guy that could really do it all, was ahead of his time. He's a guy that like fit in today's game, played multiple positions. Injuries killed him, but that doesn't take away how good he was for Detroit. The other thing about Grant Hill, you also
great college career.
May make him underrated, but also may make him overrated if people only look at that. I mean, tremendous college career, one of the best Duke players ever, if not the best Duke player ever, which says a lot.
Yeah, he was amazing. He's another guy, kind of like in the Michael Jordan mold, and what I mean by that is you brought up playing in the modern NBA. He wasn't a great three-point shooter, but I think if he had been 15 years down the road, he would have made himself a great three-point shooter, just like Michael Jordan was not a great three-point shooter. But I say with all the confidence in the world, if Jordan had come into the NBA 25 years later, you don't think he would have willed himself and taught himself to be a great three-point shooter? Absolutely, he would have.
100%. No doubt about it in my mind.
Okay, so I'm going to say we were talking NBA right there. So I'm going to stick on the NBA theme for the next guy that I want to bring up. This is a guy that because of where he played and because of the era that he played in gets overlooked a lot. Dominique Wilkins was
He's on my list.
Is he? A great pure scorer. He averaged 26 plus points per game for 10 straight seasons. But because he played in that black hole that Atlanta was, and he kind of ran around the same time as Jordan on a couple other greats, like he just completely gets slept on.
I feel like when we were coming up, and I know I'm a couple of years younger than you, for maybe even you more than me, like he was like big in like man, just one of the better players from our generation. He doesn't get a lot of love at all.
Yeah, and again, I looked that one up because I wanted to be able to kind of cite how good he was. This guy averaged 26 plus points per game for 10 straight years. That's amazing. Good luck finding that with a lot of people. I bet you LeBron maybe has never even done that because, again, he's a little more pass first, but he might have a year in there where he was like 25 points per game or something like that.
Yeah. All right, so we got one. Let's see if we have any more.
All right, go ahead. What do you got next?
All right, dude, I'm going to stick with – all right, I'm going to go back to the NFL because this guy's just jumping out at me. I thought about this guy like halfway through I was doing my list, but the more I think about it, the higher up he should be. He's not a guy that's going to go down as like a Hall of Famer, but for us especially who are big into fantasy football, this is a guy that was a monster year after year and is just completely forgotten about, and that's Steven Jackson. Not the NBA Steven Jackson, the NFL Steven Jackson for the Rams. You talk about a beast for multiple years. One of the best fantasy running backs of our generation. Not as good as, LT, not like the top tier, but right on that level below, and he just never gets mentioned. So a guy that I know I took in a lot of my fantasy drafts going up, so he is definitely on my good side. I always was, and I always will be a big Steven Jackson fan.
Yeah, he was a good player. I'd never even thought about him. And it's hard with running backs because their lifespan is so short that you really have to talk about their pinnacle. And you're going to love the last place that I go. And I'm going to save until the end because it's more of a guy his ceiling was so high. All right, you still with me? I know we're having trouble with the internet. Anything? Bueller.
Yeah,
You there?
I'm here.
So I was actually listening to Joe Rogan and Tom Segura talk about this before we got on. Internet is struggling in so many areas because streaming is at like an all-time high with everybody stuck at home. So like there's bad bandwidth like sporadically throughout the United States.
Bro, this is definitely me today. Like, no doubt. It says poor connect. Like, I don't know what the deal is. But I'm sorry.
Well, my internet's been struggling back and forth ever since the whole the pandemic started. Anyways, so
The
I
best
wanted to
thing, dude, the only that I just have to say this, like sometimes, not even sometimes, a lot of times my internet will go out, but because you have a tendency to just keep talking, you don't even realize, which is just great for me because it'll go out and you'll still be on the same point.
Yeah. All right. So I'm gonna hit up a hometown favorite. And here's a guy that, again, watching him growing up is probably to me the number one Packer player who gets underappreciated from a national level, and that's Leroy Butler, who is one of the best safeties I've ever seen play the game of football. But he never gets talked about, with the Woodson, Ed Reed type of like where he was in the era. But he was phenomenal. He is still so underappreciated from a national level. But for my money, he is one of the five best Packer players I've ever watched. Reggie, Brett, Rodgers, and then I might put Butler as the fourth best Packer player in my lifetime. This is a guy with 20 plus career sacks coming out of the backfield, many career interceptions. You did not want to throw in his direction. He perfectly complemented that front line of Reggie White and Sean Jones and Gilbert Brown. But he played a shorter career, has been a Hall of Fame snub repeatedly, the inventor of the Lambeau Leap. So from a cultural perspective, he even brings that. He was so good, but he still gets overlooked nationally because of how good the Packer teams that he played on, and Brett Favre and Reggie White taking all the thunder.
So that's definitely going to be one that is not on my list, but not because I don't agree with it, just because, I didn't watch him as much as you do. But
I wouldn't expect it to. I wanted to get up one hometown guy.
Just on that same note, though, I'm going to give one up to a hometown guy for you too. This is an honorable mention for me because it's too early. I asked you, are we doing current guys or what? This guy, as far as sports, the most underrated guy, and that's Chris Middleton for the Bucks. He's awesome. We talked about this like right when the quarantine started. On pace for a 90, 50, 40 year. Because Giannis is so good and Middleton is clearly not as good as Giannis, everyone just, assumes that all Milwaukee has is Giannis. But that is just not the case. We've talked about this a bunch. Like, what is the difference between Chris Middleton and Bradley Beal? As far as their offensive game goes, I'm not sure. So as far as current athletes go, and it goes into the point I said, it's hard for these guys to still be underrated. He might be my most underrated athlete right now in the three major pro sports.
He's a very good player. And most people, because especially the groups that we run in are all fantasy related, like people completely underrate defense. Chris Middleton is a lockdown defender. He is an excellent at 6'8" with the size and quickness that he has. He can defend almost any position on the floor outside of centers. Like you don't want to put him on a center or a point guard, but it's not like if you get him out on a version of a pick and roll that he can't defend a point guard for small periods of time, or that he's going to be a chump down in the paint or something like that. He's a very good player.
For sure. All right, you go next.
Okay. I want to talk about a guy that I know you like and you're a big fan of. And again, this is much like the Craig Biggio kind of call from a baseball perspective, and that's because he gets overlooked. Roberto Alomar, to me, is one of the better baseball players of our lifetime. But because he wasn't a power hitter and chicks and dudes dig the long ball, like people forget about him. He is one of the best defensive players we have ever seen. He played second base, but he could play shortstop, no question about it if you wanted him to. I think he has close to 500 career stolen bases. He's a 300 career hitter. But because he played in the steroid era, he gets a little bit underappreciated. I mean, he's one of the best baseball players I've ever seen play the game.
Same. And we talked about this. Did he make our all second? Was he our second baseman for our team?
Yeah.
So that tells you all you need to know. I agree with you. He definitely was a guy I thought about. Wasn't really sure. Like, I love him and I hold him in such high regard. And I feel like a lot of people in Cleveland do too, because he was so good for Cleveland. And Sandy Alomar was such a big guy here. So his brother, not really sure how the national, especially because it's been so long, views him.
I'm glad you brought that up because I was thinking about that from you as a Cleveland fan that he played there for a couple of years during those great Cleveland teams. He's probably not underrated around there, but I think if you moved outside of the places that he played, Toronto and Cleveland, he's massively underrated because you ask people who are the best baseball players of your lifetime. Ken Griffey Jr., Barry Bonds, Mike Trout, blah, blah, blah. I don't think Roberto Alomar comes up in most people's top 10, but he is as good as really anybody outside of Jr. and Bonds that I can really remember.
So I love that call. I definitely thought about him, and I definitely wanted to have one hometown call here. And it was not Roberto Alomar, although it was very close. So this is a guy that's, okay, he's still in the big leagues. At least he still was last year. He was with Cleveland years and years ago, won a Cy Young with the Angels after he was in Cleveland. But when he was in Cleveland and the Angels, he wasn't an ace. And people don't remember that now because I'll give you a hint. He's gotten out of shape, and people like to make fun. Exactly. Yeah. When you say Bartolo Colon to like the younger generation, they laugh and think about, a chubby pitcher who, maybe has some moxie on the hill and get done, but isn't very good. He was really good. Again, he won a Cy Young with the Angels, was a straight ace for Cleveland. Aside from CeCe, who we've talked about, Bartolo might have been like the best pitcher in Cleveland during the time the Indians were really good. Certainly better than like anyone we had in those 90s runs. Him and CeCe were the two aces we had like in thousands. The fact that he's still pitching now is amazing. I know that he's gotten out of shape. He's fat as hell, whatever you want to say, but it's incredible that he's still pitching. He is now underrated, and definitely underrated as far as I'm concerned. What do you think?
That happens to athletes who play for a long time. So if you look at like younger guys right now, they're probably like, they don't remember. Like if you look at like a 16-year-old kid who like watches football pretty closely, they may not remember that Larry Fitzgerald is one of the greatest wide receivers that's ever played the game of football. But because he's only been blah for like almost 5 years now, like he's still playing because he wants to play. But when Larry Fitzgerald at his prime was a top 10 wide receiver of all time, maybe. You there?
I'm here. Great point.
Okay. All right. So we're talking about wide receivers. I want to make this guy. And I know that you probably won't agree with me. And he's the second guy on my list that I hate to say it, but I actually agree with Skip Bayless on. Michael Irvin, the playmaker, is not regarded to me as high up the list of all-time great wide receivers as he should. For me, he's right there with Randy Moss and Jerry Rice as the greatest wide receivers that I've ever seen play the game of football. Go look at the numbers that he put up for a Dallas team that, one, ran the ball first with Emmitt Smith. 2, was leading a lot of games by a lot, so didn't need to throw the ball. But if you ask me if I needed to go out tomorrow and I'm sitting there drafting teams on the playground, I really, really may consider taking Michael Irvin ahead of Randy Moss and ahead of Jerry Rice. I think he was that good. He was the guy I wanted on my squad when I needed a big play made.
So I don't want to say that he's overrated, but I definitely don't consider him a guy to be like underrated. I definitely think you went over the top by saying you take him over like Randy Moss and Jerry Rice, but that's my opinion. We haven't really disagreed a lot on these, so nope. I guess we'll have to disagree on this one. Only because I consider Michael Irvin he's in the Hall of Fame. He's a rock solid Hall of Famer, and he's considered, on that next level below Jerry Rice. In terms of receivers like that we watched growing up. Like, who do you think was better, Irvin or Marvin Harrison? Who's a guy Irvin. I had on my list? I had Harrison on my list.
See, if I needed to go out and win a game tomorrow, and I love Marvin Harrison, and I think he is a little disrespected because he played with Peyton Manning for so long and he gets a lot of the glam. But for me, like, I'll take Michael Irvin. I got to go win a game tomorrow. That's the wide receiver I want. And I love Randy Moss, and Jerry Rice deserves a lot of all the accolades he deserves for longevity. Irvin's career was a little bit shorter, but his numbers and how he brought it in big games to me is as good as any wide receiver I've ever seen.
All right, sweet. That's definitely going to get me go check out some Michael Irvin highlights later on this afternoon.
All right.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. You're up.
I was going to say on the same with the football. I'm going to go back to the football. Excuse me, I don't know what I was saying there. And as you talk about a lot, it's hard for like all of us, not to have our preconceived notions about anything. So a guy that I certainly think was a really, really good NFL player that I don't think gets a lot of love nationally is London Fletcher, one of the better linebackers of our generation. Now, a big reason I love him, though, there's a college in Cleveland. It's called John Carroll. It's like a smaller Division III college. He went to John Carroll and played football there. So kind of that story like that, you can make it from basically anywhere. Not only did he make it, but, man, he was freaking good. Really long career. Cap for a couple teams he was on. Again, he's not like a Lawrence Taylor type. He's never going to go down as one of those guys. But I just think he's gotten forgotten about and wanted to give him his due praise.
Played for a long time, and the best ability is availability, which is another point I wanted to bring up with Leroy Butler. I think the guy missed 4 games in like 10 years. And the fact that you're on the field is so important. It really, really matters. That was another thing I liked about Michael Irvin. Until the end of his career, he was always out there playing, came up big in big games. So good point. All right. This is a guy that I don't think I would have brought up 3 weeks ago. But having gotten stuck watching a lot of YouTube and watching like a lot of old highlights the last couple of weeks, I can't be alone on that one. Kevin Johnson of the Phoenix Suns was a phenomenal basketball player throughout the 90s, but because Phoenix never won a championship and because he played next to Charles Barkley, who was, clearly maybe the best basketball player never to get a ring, people forget how great Kevin Johnson was. And I was watching a breakdown of what happened to those Phoenix Suns and why they never got a ring. And it was a collection of weird missed shots, injuries at the wrong time, and clearly Jordan losing to the Bulls in that one. Like those Phoenix Suns teams with him and Marley and Barkley could ball. And that's why maybe he won't get the recognition he deserves. But this guy was perennial 2010 for a while.
Yeah, I was a big Kevin Johnson fan growing up. Came from the Cavs, actually. One of like the bigger deals was traded from the Cavs to Phoenix for Larry Nance, the original Larry Nance. Both of those guys ended up being really good players. Johnson probably had the better career in terms of like numbers wise in the NBA, even though Nance still gets a lot of credit. But yeah, was kind of before his time, another guy that I loved watching. I love the point guards in that generation. My favorite player ever, I don't even know if I've told you this, is Nick Van Exel, like a guy I can just watch highlight on. And that reminds me of like the Kevin Johnson era.
I used to ball with Nick Van Exel on NBA Live way back in the day, so I like Nick Van Exel.
That's my guy. All right, I'm going to switch it back up to baseball. And
good, because my last 2 guys are baseball players.
All right, sweet. This is a guy that I think is just underrated throughout his entire career. A lefty that never threw really hard, but has a World Series ring and a no-hitter, maybe a perfect game to his name, and that's Mark Burley. Saw a lot of him in the division, as a big-time Indians fan. Was never a guy that was going to like overpower you. Kind of built in the Dallas Keuchel mold, only better. Just a big fan of Burley, and I got to give him credit for winning that World Series ring, throwing a complete game, which I don't know if you remember this, but it was either a no-hitter or a complete game, but the catch that Dwayne Wise made to seal that.
Amazing catch.
Like maybe, considering the circumstances, one of the greatest catches I've ever seen, maybe the greatest catch I've ever seen. And then also Burley has himself as one of the best defensive plays I've ever seen. Ground ball to the pitcher where it went through the 8-hole and like went. Do you remember? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do. All right, can you hear me? Yo, you back?
We're back. What's your take?
I wouldn't have thought of him, but he was another guy. He ate up a lot of innings, and I think that's an undervalued thing for baseball teams when you can get your bullpen healthy, because this guy will go out, give you 7 innings pitched, 3 runs allowed, and just keep you in almost every single ball game, especially earlier in his career. And that happens to a lot of finesse pitchers. When they really start to lose velocity as they get older, they get to be a little bit easier to hit because they just don't have the stuff. But, I mean, that was a guy that just, you could count on him. Go out there, eat some innings, keep me in the ball game religiously for years and years and years.
Yeah, exactly. Excited to hear who you got as your last 2.
I'm going to actually take my 10th that I wanted to save to the end and bring them up now because we're talking about lefty pitchers. And it goes back to the point that we brought up about the pinnacle of their career, because his career's not as long. But at the pinnacle of his career, he was as good as any pitcher that I've ever watched, and that's Johan Santana.
Ooh. I thought you were going to go – Santana's better than the guy I thought you were going to go with. but I thought you were going to go with Cliff Lee.
Cliff Lee was also very good, but for about 6 years right there, because I was living in Minneapolis watching him pitch for the Twins, Johan Santana was up there with Clayton Kershaw, Max Scherzer, Roy Halladay, any of these great guys that you can think of for their career. He was as good as any of them. I think he was top 5 Cy Young 6 years in a row. I think top 3, 4, or 5 of those years. Won it several times for the Minnesota Twins. Led the league in almost every category. Pitched every 5 days he went out there. He was so good. It's just his career was a little bit shorter, so he won't get the Randy Johnson, Greg Maddux love. But for about 5 or 6 years there, he was up there with Pedro, Max, Clayton, is the best pitchers I've ever seen.
So that matters, right? That his career was shortened. Like that
Definitely.
means he wasn't as good as these guys. And same as like Grant Hill, but it is very similar to the Grant Hill pick. If not even Santana, that Hill hits.
Yeah, man, because he won't go down. Like even in, like I kind of don't even forget about him, and I was there watching him. I was literally at Twins games watching him pitch, and people couldn't touch him. I don't know if anybody can hear me. This is I've been watching. All right, you back now?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. All right, who do you got?
So sure I'm gonna go with. I don't have the numbers to back this up. I just don't think that he gets the love that he should. Similar trend to all these guys because they're underrated, and that's Mike Mussina. Saw a lot of him in the 90s with the Orioles. Really was the ace of that Orioles staff. Pitched a really long, successful career, and just kind of gets lost in the shuffle when you talk about the best pitcher. Number one in his own right that led Baltimore, really far in the playoffs. Unfortunately, they lost to those really good Indians teams, but the reason Baltimore was even there was because of Mussina. So I got him on my list.
Yeah, he was very good. Very underappreciated from a historic perspective, but a heck of a good pitcher. And I know you got to get out of here, so we will run through these last couple ones pretty quickly. The last guy I'll bring up, too, is also a baseball player. I feel like I saw somebody mention this on Twitter, so it was in my mind. But a great defensive player who has almost 400 career home runs is Jim Edmonds.
Ooh, I love that call.
Yeah.
Did you just see his name because he got coronavirus?
Oh, did he? I saw somebody else mention him on Twitter, just following a million different sports people. It was a DFS guy. I just don't remember which one it was, but that he's a guy who always gets underappreciated. Great defensive center fielder, but also almost 400 career home runs. And he played almost all of his years for both the Angels and Cardinals, which played in very quality pitching parks, which means he had to patrol huge outfields. And again, if you had played in Cincinnati or Milwaukee or Cleveland, this guy probably has 500 career home runs.
I can't tell you how upset I am about my internet messing up because I have so much to say about all these guys. I love the Jim Edmonds call. That's like exactly what we're talking about when we made this list. Guys that were, really, really good when they played, like considered, perennial all-stars, some of the best in their positions that now don't really get thought about at all. Edmonds is that guy. I love that call. I love that call. I didn't think about it at all. And because there's so many baseball players and baseball players are easier to call out than football players, they were naturally the ones that were easier to list. However, my last one, and I'm really interested to get your take on this. I'm going back to the NBA. And I think he doesn't get the love that he deserves because of Michael Jordan and that's Scottie Pippen. What do you think?
Oh, yeah. Scottie Pippen is massively underrated. And it's part of anybody who played by Jordan gets completely just underappreciated. Like Tony Kukoc was really good. Steve Kerr could shoot the three with anybody and continuously made big shots. I was going back, kind of hitting up the history of sports the last couple of weeks in just desperation mode to watch it. Like watching Michael Jordan miss all these big shots and all these highlights, but then Pippen gets the rebound and kicks out to Kerr and he hits a big three. Like Jordan gets all the credit, but there were some good players on those teams, and Scottie Pippen might be the best wing defender we have ever seen.